Bonjour, mes amis. It is delightful to be here with you this evening. I'm very passionate and happy and excited to be talking about what we're talking about this evening. This is part of our ongoing series where we're exploring the ideas of nature versus nurture. And today in particular, we're going to be looking at how clinical care and more pointedly, what you do once you know about your genes, how do you change that into action, can really shift what nature has given you through nurture. And I'm delighted to have this conversation with you this evening with our own infamous and clinician and DNAU Dean, Dr. Lara Varden. Medell, welcome. It's good to see you.
Well, hello, good evening. Thank you so much. I so enjoy doing these webinars with you, with our team. Uh, it's it is so exciting, the nature versus nurture, that series that we are doing and diving into what we're going to be talking about tonight. How we're different, what we are doing,
Mhm.
about our test and the way we interpret it. I think
Mhm.
it'll be very exciting for our audience. And I am very grateful for every member of our audience being here. Actually,
Mhm.
I would love to know if we have any new audience members here tonight.
Mhm.
If you are new to our community or new to participating in our webinars, can you throw a one in the chat? I would love to see how many new people we have joining us tonight. So throw a one in the chat if you are new to our community or new to our webinars. Oh, beautiful. Look at this. Oh, how wonderful.
Bonjour,
I'm
mes
seeing
amis.
some ones. Excellent. Thank you
Mhm.
so much for joining us. We're so happy that you're here.
Yeah, so members, new and old, let me talk to you about what we're going to be exploring today. So we're going to be doing a bit of storytelling because it's important to offer science through story. So we're gonna talk through a little bit of our genesis story. So we're going to talk through how we generated our DNA 360, that panel, and how that has really transformed and shifted through 8,000 clinical visits, as the name of tonight's webinar. Portrays. Dr. Varden and I are each going to then share a case where we saw, or a patient encounter, where we saw this enlivened. And then at the very end of the webinar, we're going to explore some practical clinical pearls, practical clinical tips that both she and I have learned over our time practicing, so that hopefully you can bring that into your own world, so that if you have specific genes or specific health concerns that you're working on, you can translate that in a way that's easy and authentic to you, and feels like a natural change as opposed to something that you're climbing uphill to achieve. Yeah, so why don't we dive into it? Again, by way of introduction, especially for those who are new to us. My name is Dr. Krista Kosterman. I am Chief Science Officer here at the DNA Company, which essentially means I'm a professional nerd and very grateful to be so. This is Napita. She runs the show. And then Dr. Lara Varden is an in-house clinician with the DNA Company, as well as Dean of DNAU, which is the more academic and clinician-focused offering to really help some people dive deeper into the genes.
And allows me to tap into my nerd, which I love.
Yeah. You can always pick out the nerds in the crowd when they just the glasses, but separate those that get really excited and been like, I get to be a nerd. I'm paid to do this. All right. Yeah, actually, if there's any professional nerds in the audience, please let us know. I know that we have a prof of computer science who frequents this, and I would
Oh,
imagine we have
absolutely.
quite a few other nerds in the crowd. So self-identify. All right. So let's get on with the story. I wanna start with how our testing came to be, because it's quite a beautiful story. So the DNA company has been around for about 10 years, and it started with a twinkle in someone's eye. And that twinkle really sat around this awareness that genes were becoming more and more accessible to consumers, right? It was no longer this thing that you had to go through a hospital, you had to go through very intensive hoops in order to get your genes. They were becoming commercialized. Technology was enabling genes to be something that everyday people could access to an extent on demand, right? And so the idea was, if we are going to be getting more and more access to genes, what does that change? How does that impact healthcare planning, right? Especially outside of the space of disease identification, right? So all of us have probably heard about genes like BRCA, right? We have heard BRCA really strongly associated with things like breast cancer, right? ApoE, we hear about that associated with dementia. But they're, thankfully, beautifully, not everyone is getting breast cancer, not everyone is getting dementia, but there's a lot of things that people want to do outside of those. They want to improve their mental health. They want to improve their cardiovascular health. They want to improve their diet and their weight, right? There's concerns that sit outside of disease. And so the idea 10 years ago, the twinkle in someone's eye, and it was Dr. Mansour Muhammad, it was in his eye. The idea was, how do we take what we know in genes, especially more that functional side, that day-to-day side, not that disease side? How do we take that and start bringing it into the clinic? And this is one of the more interesting points, I think, within our panel, especially as I look across the landscape of everyone who is doing genetic panels, right? When you look at a lot of genetic panels, they're testing everything and then a bag of potato chips. They're presenting not millions, but hundreds of genes. And they're saying, here's all the secrets. But when you get down to it, what is actually translating, right? And in my experience, it's two pieces that are missing. The first piece is there's way too much information. People get overwhelmed by the information. And separate to that, not all of the information is actionable, right? So those, to an extent, became the litmus tests of, does a gene make it into the panel? The litmus test really is, if I have one presentation, Dr. Varden has the opposite presentation, does that change the clinical advice that we are given, right? And so for a gene to make it into our panels, right, that has to be true, right? And so we created panels first and foremost with that in mind. Now, where do those 8,000 cases come in? Everyone knows that, whatever they studied in school, some people studied medicine, some people studied math, some people studied woodworking, some people studied, everyone studied something. And most people can tell you what I learned in my textbook is actually different than what showed up in my world, right? So if you're a woodworker, maybe the textbook said, measure twice, cut once, and make sure you cut in this way. And the first part is true. You should always measure twice, only cut once. But maybe the second part, cutting this way, actually didn't turn out to be true. Maybe that's because you as a person are left-handed instead of right-handed. Maybe that's because the textbook was only considering one sort of wood as opposed to different sorts. But we all know, we've all probably have those examples in our head of where a book said one thing, and it was kind of true, it was mostly true. But when we tried to play with it in the real world, it didn't fully show up that way for us. Maybe that's because we're left-handed and the book was written for right-handed people, or in the case of genes, right? Typically, when genetic studies are done, they're done on a singular gene and often one or two different outcomes. They don't consider multiple genes. They don't consider as well the whole host of things that can be going on with a person, right? If we're studying a gene that is specific to cardiovascular and we're only looking at cardiovascular outcomes, it's neglecting other things that influence cardiovascular outcomes, like maybe stress, like maybe how much you're sleeping, right? Things that are important to cardiovascular outcomes, but not necessarily directly there. And that's where this 8,000 case part became really, really important, right? What was happening here was there was an awareness. We picked genes that were really important because they would differentiate, right? I have a presentation and my advice might be white. Dr. Varden has the opposite presentation, so her advice is black, right? But that doesn't always ring true when you combine the fullness of the person, all their health history, all their experiences of the world, all their other conditions. And so this became where it was really important to, step outside of a textbook and start meeting with people, start understanding firsthand, how did these genes show up in the clinic space? How does that influence what we want to be doing, right? And audience, will be very plain. In no instance did we find that a gene said, oh, a person was going to present this way, and categorically we found that that wasn't true. It was always in the nuance, right? It was always in the nuance, and that's what those 8,000 taught us. And that's what Dr. Varden and I want to explore with you this evening. We want to talk about, after we've done, these 8,000 cases, we did those about 5 years ago. We have 5 years under our belt since then. We have a lot of new genes that have come into play. We have a lot of new experiences that have come into play. And so we want to talk about how this testing gets enlivened when we look at the full picture of the patient, when we look at all the genes together, and when we really want to say, hey, let's put this into action. Let's take this outside of the book. Let's put the feet to the ground. Let's actually dance with this. Let's actually work with it. So that's where Dr. Varden and I want to go this evening. Audience, let us know if that sounds good to you. I think Dr. Varden and I right now, what we're going to do is we're each going to present a case where Jean said one thing and the clinic experience was a little bit different and interesting and something that we can all learn from. And then we're going to dive deep into what are some tips and tricks towards how do we actually jump out of the textbook, come onto the ground and start actually running. And so I want you to start thinking about, for that section of how do we actually start running, right? Think about things that you really want to learn about. Think about things of, this is the health thing that I'm struggling with and I love some actionable tips for. Or maybe think about, I tried this habit. Everyone said that if I spend 5 minutes a day doing this, I'm told it would work. And it didn't. Toss that in the chat. Let us know how we can support you, in particular in this application side of things, because textbooks are wonderful and clearly they're one of my favorite things, but they're not everything. We have to look at practicing. All right.
Yeah. And I like the comment Mike just said, practical experience beats textbook theory, which I kind of agree with that, but there is a lot of good textbook theory that does play out in practical experience as well.
Yeah.
Otherwise those textbooks wouldn't be worth, the paper they're written on. But I do like the comment. I do understand that.
Yeah. So Mike, that's what we're going to be exploring this evening. Dr. Varden, I've talked way too much so far. Why don't you offer your case? And
Absolutely.
then mine. Yeah.
So I recently had a client, a gentleman, middle age. He was actually middle age. I should say this because he's like my age, so I'm talking like early mid 50s, and I don't consider myself old. I still have a lot more to go. Anyway, so when we went over his profile and his pathways, he had an incredible, like really good cardiovascular profile. We're talking 1G for his 9p21. So to kind of anchor people a little bit, by the way, if you have your DNA 360 reports, pull them out. Okay, you can kind of like flip through and see what yours are to kind of cross-reference some of the things that we may be talking about. When I'm talking about your cardiovascular profile, you will find it in the cardiovascular reports. You can also take a look at your genes on our app, The DNA Way. So if you bring that up, you can actually bring up information right on the app. Everything's right there. Love it. So in any case, so when I'm talking about the 9p21 gene, it's actually a gene locus. It's not like a gene in and of itself, like a lot of the other genes that we look at. And basically what it is, it's a location on the chromosome, and we are looking at 3 different locations on it. Okay, so with 2 chromosomes, so there's a total of 6. And we are looking for G alleles, okay, out of the 4 nucleotides we're looking at to see if it has the G, because there's A, T, C, and G. And depending on how many G's you have, the more you have out of the total of 6. So you either have 0 or up to 6. The more you have, it tells us the more sensitive the endothelial lining of your cardiovascular system, of the arteries, how sensitive that is. So again, the more G's, the more sensitive. The less G's, less sensitive. Well, this gentleman only had 1 G. So actually, he was not as sensitive to toxins in the system. He had all of his other markers, his ACE gene, his NOS3. The NOS3 works with nitric oxide production, ability for vasodilation. The ACE gene works in reading and working with fluids with, it's called the SALT gene. So it works in conjunction with the NOS3 and vasodilation, vasoconstriction. ApoE, he was a 3-3. So actually average, good. I mean, again, nice profile. And the interesting thing is that in his history, actually in January of this year, he had had a stroke. And I was just like, wow, that made me really curious, because that's not something you would typically expect from someone, and we're talking textbook here, with that kind of a genetic profile. And of course, keeping with that open mind and realizing your genes do not tell you everything. They are just one piece of the puzzle. Granted, a very important piece, a foundational piece that provides a lot of information, that blueprint. This is where the nature and nurture comes in, because your DNA is the nature. It's what you are given, that blueprint. But then we have the nurture. What's been going on in this gentleman's life that would cause this dichotomy of seeing something genetically that you wouldn't expect, but then he had a stroke. He had high cholesterol levels, high LDL, high, blood panel markers that would indicate that there is inflammation and other issues going on. So when we were talking, I found out that he had a lot of trauma that had happened within the last year to year and a half. He had lost several of his family members, his wife, his mother, his father, and his brother. And they were all very close. And it was absolutely devastating for him. And that stress, that the trauma, the grief that he went through, it caused him so much stress over an extended period of time that it just was overwhelming. His body was trying to manage all of this, and it couldn't very well. And so it became reflective in him having his blood levels go off because of the cortisol, the increased stress, because of other hormone changes, the lack of good quality sleep because of the grief, the stress he was going through, that he ended up not eating so well because of those emotional feelings. His lifestyle, which was usually very good, was now disrupted in such a way that it made him have these pathophysiological experiences of having a stroke, even though when you look at his genetics, you would not expect that. So this really lends into genetics doesn't tell you everything. It gives you a good foundation, but we need to keep in mind on what's your history? What have you been through? What's going on in your life? What have you been exposed to? Have you been able to handle that? So it absolutely broke my heart, obviously. And thankfully, the the love, the compassion, the family strength that he had with his family growing up gave him that ability to work through. It still doesn't make it any less traumatizing or difficult for the grief, but his perspective, his way of moving through it to be able to heal was so tremendous. And working with me, I was able to give him even more tips, more ways of looking at things, because his detoxification pathways, I do have to say, were not the best. So we were able to give him things, supplements, changes in food, to be able to support that, to help clear the cortisol, doing things like grounding, breath work, meditation, ways to calm the nervous system, looking at different groups that he could be with for working through that grief, through the process of losing someone, because it is a process, and having people there, having a community there to be able to support him. He had very strong uh, spiritual, religious belief system. So he has that community as well. So it really was leaning into that, and then giving him other tips and ways to help with his sleep. He didn't think about, oh, I should have it completely dark in my room. I should have it be a cooler temperature. I should really lean into the fact of being more fastidious on going to bed at the same time every night, waking up at the same time every morning, even on the weekends, you know, including these little lifestyle things to try to smooth out those rough edges to make it a little bit easier in that healing process. So that's my story, and I honor him, and I learned so much from him, and it was such a joy, and I'm very grateful to have been able to help him on his health journey.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Varden. I appreciate you. And audience, I have a bit of an opposite story, if you will. So what Dr. Varden just went through was someone who we saw with really good genes, right? Something you wouldn't necessarily expect, but life tossed them different curveballs. And so the nurture to the nature expressed, unfortunately, in a negative way. And I want to talk about the opposite. So, where the nature of it, the DNA of it, isn't necessarily as positive, but the curveballs that nurture threw at it balance it out. So here's the story of this one. So I I learned relatively early on when I was, supporting people with not only interpreting their genes, but more importantly, what do we do about it? The thing I learned that if genes said a person should be presenting in a certain way and they weren't, it was a really, really important question to ask, why not? So, and as a just as a heads up to everyone in this, anytime we see people here at the DNA company, clinically speaking, the first thing we look at before we meet with a patient is going to be their mood and behavior report. And the reason we do that is there's a lot of insight in the mood and behavior report that can help us approach the client that we're working with. So for example, and if you have your DNA 360, I really encourage you to bring it out and go to the system summary page in that, and I'll reference a few genes. So if you're hoping to look up those genes as well, you can do that with me. So as a clinician, when I look at that section, I look at a few different genes to understand what is this person's focus going to be like? Are they someone that's able to focus in really well, or is their attention going to be more scattered? There's a few genes that play into this, but the bigger one that I look at is going to be something called 5-HTT-LPR. Okay. The other genes that I want to look at is really motivation and reward and ability to learn from negative outcomes. And to learn that, I look at both COMT and DRD2. Okay, so before I see any patients, I'll look at that. I'll also look at a few other genes really to get insight into, do they have depressed or anxious tendencies? Are they going to get really trapped in worry, some cyclical thought patterns, right? Mood and behavior is able to give me a snapshot of that. Another thing that I've learned, and before we get to the patient, doing, all this work with clients, is that it is very, very, very rare to see one system, a system being, for example, mood and behavior, as Dr. Varden was talking about, a system being cardiovascular. It is exceptionally rare to see someone with an entire system that is suboptimal. Sometimes you might have a weak system where you have a few different genes that are not optimal, but next to never do I see presentations where I'm like, ooh, poor thing. And so when I was reviewing this woman's report before I saw her, got to the mood and behavior section, and I was like, oh Lord, I felt bad for her and I felt bad for me. I felt bad for me because me as a doctor, I would have to come to her and she did not have great attention. It was going to be scattered. She had all the tendencies towards anxiety and depression. She had all the tendencies and predispositions towards kind of really holding on to trauma and intrusive thoughts and cyclical thoughts. She was like just a hot mess when it came to her genes. And I was a little bit nervous because as a clinician, those appointments are a little bit more tricky. If someone's attention is scattered, if they're worried about everything, it just makes for a little bit more of a difficult encounter because they definitely need the support, but it's hard to poke through in a way that's going to be helpful. So I was a little nervous about this appointment. I was getting all ready. I show up, and this delightful, pleasant, grounded woman showed up. She sailed into the room, she sat down, she was very focused on me. She had health concerns, none of which had to do with mood, behavior, focus, motivation, depression, nothing along those lines. She had something that was completely not opposite, but it was just completely unrelated to that. And I remember sitting there and being like, did I pull up the wrong gene report? Like, ooh, I haven't done that yet, but there's a first for everything. Like maybe I pulled the report up. But when we dove into her other problems, her genes aligned with that. And so I was working through this appointment, and the whole time in the back of my head, I was like, what am I gonna ask her? She's crazy. And finally near the end, I said, hey, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I poked around and I asked a few questions around attention and behavior and depression and things like that. And this is eventually what I learned. What I eventually learned is that this woman had been born to, her mother was a psychotherapist. And so she had grown up in a home that, from a mental health perspective, mental health was treated like body health. And so she had grown up with different meditation practices. She knew when you get anger, here's ways to de-escalate. When you get sad, here's ways to support yourself. So she had grown up in a world where mental health was really important, and she had a lot of tools in her toolbox to manage it. What also became interesting was this comment that she made. So she had, I think it was two other siblings. I think there were three in total. And she made the comment to me, she's like, we all grew up, we technically all have the same DNA, we had the same mom, we had the same experiences. It's not like I got hit by a bus and they were fine. We all have had the same experiences, more or less, but they don't have to work hard for their mental health. This was so interesting to me. She's like, every day I have to dedicate time in my day so that I don't become depressed, so that I have focus, so that I don't have intrusive memories. And she's like, if I let those habits slip, I notice my natural tendencies. Whereas my brother and sister, she's like, they don't have to do anything. They do stuff if the world blows up, but other than that, they're doing nothing to preserve their mental health. And she's like, I have to work at it all the time. And she's like, as well as if something goes wrong, if ish hits the proverbial fan, she's like, I'm out of it for a few days. Like, I just can't manage that sort of stress. So to me, what was really interesting and what I've always kept from her case was number one, even if you have a system where a doctor's like, oh, I'm a little bit scared of this, it doesn't mean it's going to present. That does not mean that it is going to be how that person experiences and navigates the world. But it also taught me that if you have really suboptimal tendencies, you got to put in a lot of work to balance them out. It is the work truly that balances them out. And this woman, like, serendipitously, beautifully, blessedly so, however you want to experience and phrase that, she was born with very suboptimal genes in that regard, but she was born in a home that naturally supported and prevented that more negative outcome. So, audience, I really do want you to hear this story, that both things can be true. Dr. Varden talked about someone who had great genes on paper, and yet life threw them a few curveballs, so they didn't present as so. And then I met someone who I was a little bit scared of. My heart hurt for their genes, and they showed up as if they had optimal genes. So, audience, it's really, really important. This is what those 8,000 cases and seeing the person as a whole and working with a provider has taught us. Okay. And so now, Dr. Varden, I wonder if we start exploring how people on this call, how people on this webinar can start, getting out of the textbook, putting feet to pavement a little bit. This is how people run. And I wonder if we can explore how people can start doing that. And again, audience, I've been looking in the chat and I haven't seen anyone really say, hey, I'm struggling with this, or can we focus on this? So, Dr. Varden, I wonder if you want to talk about, I know you're a big proponent of this. I see this often in your clinical work, where you focus on small changes as opposed to big changes.
Oh, absolutely. Before I jump into that, though, I do want to say that I have had several clients where their genes do not match their presentations. And so it's not necessarily uncommon. And had people come in going, oh, well, my genes say that I should have issues, with my relationship to food, and that, I could be a binge eater, or, eating because of anxiety or stress and all this other stuff. And they're like, I don't have any problems with food. I'm a good weight. I do. And so this person I'm talking about in particular said, wow, I don't know if I can really trust this. I don't know if this is right. I don't know if, if this DNA is this, and they almost lost a little faith in the information of it. And this is what I want to tell people, that yes, your genes are your genes, but it really is based in the context. This is how that almost a 50% influencing of genes to nature, or to nurture, to your environment, to your experiences, to how you were raised, that it doesn't mean that your genetic profile is deterministic or diagnostic. And this is what we tell people. If you've got an ApoE4, it doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's. If you have 9p21 6Gs, it doesn't mean that you are going to have a heart attack, or anything like that. You have to take that puzzle piece and put it in the right place. And it was interesting because after I spoke to that, got to know them and teased out information and asking them about their background, come to find out that this client who said, oh, I have no problems with food, I don't, that this DNA is wrong. This client actually had grown up with, similar to your client that you talked about, Dr. Kosterman, their parents were very much in the health field, nutrition, and they raised the kids, she and her siblings, on how to eat, on what to eat, were very conscientious about it. she didn't piece it together. And it was never in her purview that that was an issue. So yes, you can trust it, but it also lets you know and should empower you that even if your genetics have a propensity in a certain way, you have the power to change that. You are empowered by knowing that to be able to shift the context of your diet, of your lifestyle, of your mindset, of the things that you do and believe and action to make changes. So I wanted to put that forth before I jumped into making small changes. So, oh, we have a couple people that had popped into the chat. Some things that they were dealing with and wanted to have some information on. So, you know what? Maybe we'll take information that they have, and then I can give even little stepwise things of small bites. So, someone in the chat says that they're struggling with high blood pressure, even though the genes are good. Okay, so in things like that, I would say, first of all, lots of questions. Is your blood pressure consistently high all the time? Or is it, high just when you go to the doctor? Because there is such a thing as white coat syndrome, that when you get in there and that you get nervous and your heart starts to pump more and you get nervous and tight, and there's issues because when they put that blood pressure cuff on you, they want you to sit and relax, and a lot of times it's like they'll put it on like right when you sit down and you're and you get nervous, and of course it'll be a little higher. So there are some questions I would ask about that. But then there's also the fact of asking about lifestyle. Has this always been an issue, or did this just recently happen? Is it something, did something happen recently? Has your diet changed? Have you been exposed to any particular toxins that can affect blood pressure? First, there's a lot of questions that I ask to try to get to the root of what's going on, or what could impact what the issue is that someone has. Because knowing that allows for the opportunity to say, these are some things that you can start implementing in your life to start making changes. You have to know what the problem is to be able to fix it. So, but in a general sense, you want to look at foundational things. Okay. So you want to look at the things that you're taking in. When we're talking about foundational items, okay, look at what we have to survive. We have to have air, we have to drink water, and we have to eat food. Of course, although some people might argue with that and say, no, you can fast for a long time and still survive. But we'll just say air, water, food. Okay. Are those things that help to promote health, or are they hindering optimal health? So, for example, water. No, let's take air, because if we don't have air, we'll be dead in like just a few minutes. So, your air quality. Take a look at your air quality in your home. Do you live in a moldy home? Do you live in a home that has that may be close to an airport or a train station that's giving off toxic air? So if so, well, then maybe cleaning up the air that you are existing in, getting an air filter, Start with air filter. Maybe some plants. Plants are great natural air cleaners. Okay. So just find one thing to change at a time. If that's all you can do, or if you want to do a couple things, just implement that.
Mm-hmm.
And then start building on.
Yeah.
So I know you look like you want to chirp in and provide some wonderful pearls of wisdom.
Yeah, no, I think small changes tend to be a little bit more accessible to the human brain, right? The human brain likes really small things and it doesn't like to change in general. And so I don't do this as much anymore. I used to train and teach people in meditation. And oftentimes in particular for people who really wanted to take it on, I'd say, okay, let's start with a minute per day. And they'd be like, a minute? We should at least start with half an hour. I want to be a real meditator, whatever that means. And I'm like, nope, we're gonna start with a minute. And the reason that was really important, that's less scary to the brain. And it's a lot easier on a daily basis, especially where a change feels like it's going to be too big for someone to take on, right? Because we want to create consistency. To quote Justin, we want to chalk in those wins. So on days, especially when you're trying to create that meditation habit or whatever health habit it is, figuring out with that small thing that feels so small that you could do it even in a really big day becomes important because that's how you seed those habits. And so I take that because I taught a lot of people to meditate. I bring that into a lot of my clinical practice now. So if let's just say I'm surprised at how many people don't eat vegetables. It's cool, but a lot of people don't eat vegetables. And I think it's not necessarily fair to tell people, hey, go eat. We want to get you eating vegetables. So have at least 3 servings per day. For some people, that doesn't feel accessible. So instead, if you're someone who doesn't eat vegetables or whatever it might be, instead of saying 3 times per day, the goal is for the first 2 weeks, just having vegetables once a day, right? That starts to seed those habits. And so I think that becomes really important when you're trying to bake in new health habits from what you're doing. Make it so small that on days where you're stressed, you're like, cool, I can still do this. Yeah, because the importance is yeah, that would be, I think that's something I've learned a lot over time. Because I think
Mhm.
everyone, when they walk into the clinic, they want to boil the ocean, like you said, they want to do absolutely everything, but everything isn't possible. So we start with something that even on your worst days you can achieve, because then you slowly, that becomes second nature. And then we get to add
Mhm.
something else.
And it's always nice to do things that are free,
Yeah.
like breathing. We don't normally think of that. It's like we breathe over 27,000 times a day. But how are we breathing? Just simple things, just taking a moment and thinking about it and feeling your body breathe. Are you breathing shallowly where it's just little breaths? Are your shoulders going up and down when you're breathing? If you take are you going like this and breathing in the upper chest? And this gets into into the work that you did with breath work. Or are you belly breathing
Yeah.
and playing around with it, being curious with it? I tell my clients, breathe with your entire lungs. Feel that barrel breath of just filling in and visualizing that breath filling up even the very bottom parts of your lungs. And just take a nice big breath. Just feel it. It only takes a moment, but to really get in touch with your body, because the breath is so important. And just learning and feeling the different ways to breathe. And then eventually, I have this one um, particular technique to get people to take some deeper breaths. I call it the 10 penny technique, where they put 10 pennies in one of their pockets. During the day, they take a penny out, take 10 deep breaths in the nose, just out the mouth, and just take 10 breaths, and then put that penny in the other pocket. And then later in the day, take another penny out, 10 deep breaths, only takes a few seconds, put it in the other pocket. You do all 10 pennies. By the end of the day, you've taken 100 deep breaths. Little things, and they're fun, they're free, and you can take it anywhere you go.
Love that. Thanks. So let's continue on because I'm seeing a few questions and a few points. I think why don't we speak on, so Margaret, Dr. Varden, you inspired Margaret to ask a really good question. Margaret's asking, so you talk through this cardiovascular patient, how 9p21 can influence inflammation at the endothelial lining, so close audience. They want to know that if a person has a poor presentation there, what can they do to support their lining? Dr. Varden, what are some of your go-tos for that?
Well, a lot of that really is a matter of contributing, having the right foods. You want to make sure that you're having foods that support good cellular health. So looking at your omega-3s, okay, because this also works into when you're talking about cardiovascular profiles. A lot of times higher cholesterol levels, higher LDLs, that's a lot of times when people come and do that. So nutritional strategies, okay, also helping to increase nitric oxide production and support. So again, leaning into foods, you want to have foods rich in nitrates like beets and arugula and spinach and things with polyphenols, things like pomegranate or blueberries and green tea and dark chocolate, which is one of my favorites. And also working in things that have magnesium and potassium. This helps to relax blood vessels, reduce endothelial stress. But there are supplements. I mean, obviously, magnesium, potassium, you can get these things in supplementation. But there is a wonderful product because I actually use it myself because my cardiovascular profile is not the greatest. It's called Arterosil. And it's a wonderful product for people who have a more sensitive endothelial lining, like myself. My 9p21, I've said it before, I actually have 5Gs, so I'm much more sensitive. It's through Calroy Health Sciences, and a wonderful product, and that really helps to support the glycocalyx lining, that mucosal lining, to protect the endothelial layer. But again, lots of different things that you can help to support your cardiovascular. So it's not just nutrition and supplementation, exercise, lifestyle approaches, okay? Optimizing the sleep, because poor sleep worsens, excuse me, that the endothelial lining, the dysfunction. And of course, there's always the breath work that I just said, because that helps with stress management. And then always, whenever it comes to cardiovascular, what have we always heard? Don't smoke. So, I mean, obviously, not doing things that can directly damage, like smoking, excess alcohol, things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that you can do to help support your cardiovascular health.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think one thing I encourage people who have a suboptimal or poor presentation of 9p21 in particular is to really look into their inflammation and detox profiles. Because remember, you think about your endothelial lining is something where blood is running through it 24 hours a day, and our blood carries good things, oxygen, other immune things that we need. Blood is also a highway for trash to go to the liver, to go to the kidney. And so that endothelial lining is always bumping up against that trash in a 24 hours way. So knowing how your body detoxes, as well as what detox or what toxin inputs, as Dr. Varden has talked about before, becomes really important, because if you have that higher G count for 9p21, you become, or you need to be incredibly focused on the environmental inputs and the toxin inputs and how you're cleaning that up. And so that can be definitely ways with shifting your environment, but as well shifting the way you're living your life. So as Dr. Varda mentions, exercise, you also want to think through sleep becomes exceptionally important for you, breath work, things of those natures. And those are things that I would really offer you want to be chatting about with a clinician. I think a lot of the one thing I've learned from having gone through all the reports that we have, I wasn't part of the original 8,000, but all of the reports that we have gone through and done is that it's really important to put genes against how your lifestyle currently is and things of that nature. Yeah. All right. I think the next question, yeah, so Christine, I think Dr. Varnon's going to put the arterial salt in the chat for you.
Yeah, I just did.
Uh, I want to, Julie has a good question for us, but before we speak to that, I just want to round out the cardiovascular conversation. Melissa's asking the question, how do you treat high cholesterol if you don't want to be on statins? This is a delightful one. So, Melissa, I'd say first and foremost, this has to be a conversation with your doctor, because I don't know what you mean when you say high cholesterol, but I will offer a few thoughts here. Number one, high cholesterol can be a reflection of inflammation in your system. So you need to understand, is this a true high cholesterol picture, or is this more the body is increasing cholesterol because inflammation is very high? If this is a dietary thing, you need to look at genes and understand, is this a genetically inspired thing, or is this more a lifestyle inspired thing? From a cholesterol perspective, short of medication, insoluble fibers, think about psyllium husk, flaxseed husk, things of that nature, are one of the best ways to be supporting it. Alongside, there's good research with omega-3s and extra virgin olive oil. So there's a combination of those three things that you can do in order to lower it. That said, you really do need to be working with your doctor. If you have a family history of heart attack and stroke, if you have a personal history of it, and a few other things, statins might be an appropriate call for you. And I know some people are worried about how statins can impact the brain. Work with your doctor. You can do, there's a panel out of Boston University that looks at a few metabolites that when you go on statins, those metabolites can be reflective of, is this impacting your brain in negative ways? So if you and your doctor get to a point where medication is required and advised, you can do blood work to check how is it impacting the brain. So I'd really work with a doctor there, and just everyone else on the call. This is something that comes up and is a really popular topic. So I just wanted to address it point on, because we're very inspired about cardiovascular health tonight.
Oh, absolutely. And I did want to mention that nattokinase is actually something that has been used in Japan and other countries for many, many years. And there's great research in the use of nattokinase. So anyway, that actually studies have found that nattokinase supplementation can significantly reduce total cholesterol, a lot of these other markers, LDL. But again, like Dr. Kosterman said, this is something that you would need to speak with your doctor, see if this is something that would, work well for you, etc. So, but there is a lot of research on it.
Yeah, thanks. All right, Dr. Ryan, Julie has a question. They've struggled with constipation their whole life. They're mid-50s now. What are some things that you can suggest to bring in to consider if constipation is the thought there?
Well, you need to consider mechanical and lifestyle foundations. So mechanical being movement. How much movement are you getting in your life? So without knowing any of your background, knowing, that lifestyle aspect or diet aspect, just general recommendations. You want to have regular movement, regular walking, stretching, core strengthening, things like yoga or Pilates. This stimulates this. It's that movement of the gut to be able to move the food through your body, to have that transit time, which is the time that you put food in your mouth to the time that it comes out your butt. So that transit time is generally, anywhere from, say, 18, 24 hours up to 48 hours. So, you know, but you need to move your body. I will say that being sedentary, sitting a lot, not moving very much, that will slow that transit time. Another thing, hydration. Even mild dehydration can make stools harder and slower. So you really want to aim for, taking in about, well, I say kind of like a rule of thumb, half your body weight in ounces, at least. A lot of times people go, oh, 2.5 liters a day. But your body needs to be hydrated. So make sure you do that. You can always add electrolytes, especially if you tend to run low on minerals like sodium, potassium, magnesium, things like that. But there's also a matter of that routine. The colon is most active after meals. We call it the, oh, wow, I just lost my word. Anyway, I'll think of it. Anyway, it's active after meals, especially after breakfast. The having a morning routine, hydration, a warm liquid, gentle movement, that can train the gut to go, okay, time to go to the bathroom. And of course, then working in that dietary aspect, what Dr. Kosterman was saying, fiber. Insoluble fiber, vegetable seeds, bran, that adds the bulk. That's your insoluble fiber. And then you have soluble fiber, things like the psyllium husk, chia, flax, oats, this really gels the stool and feeds the good bacteria. So, yeah, a lot of those, kind of works through, you could dive a little bit deeper into gut biome, what's going on there, stress. But in general, those are the basic rules of thumb, to be able to poop regularly.
Yeah, and I would offer to Julie or anyone else who's struggling with constipation, if they've done everything that Dr. Varden just outlined and they're not seeing improvement in movement there, right? Checking in with the doctor, because there are people who have true motility issues, and there's different tests that can be done to assess the motility of your lower colon, making sure that it's being activated properly, because there are instances where that nervous system connection just isn't there, and so you're not able to physically move it along, and it's helpful to know that. So if you engage with the doctor, they can support that sort of workup. All right. Christy has our next question, and they're saying, what can a person do / eat to fix the SNPs from demonstrating? So Christy, I'll start off with an anecdote, and then I'll allow Dr. Varden to jump in with kind of more of the clinical pearls. FTO is considered the proverbial fat gene. We report on this gene in our diet and nutrition section. It's in the appetite report in diet and nutrition. And people with a suboptimal presentation of FTO, statistically speaking, are much more likely to have central adiposity, so that's your proverbial beer gut, and just be overweight, have a higher BMI. This gene was discovered, unearthed, probably 20 years ago. I don't know. I don't do time. It was a while ago. It's one of the first guys. It's an OG. And so there's been a lot of study on it. And one of the more interesting things that they found, so this is FTO, right? It's appetite, it's diet. You think that this is a gene where you're like, cool, I have to change the way I'm eating. Something that can mitigate and neutralize this risk, meaning the risk of being overweight and having high BMI and that central adiposity, is exercise. Scientists found that if you have this gene, but you balance it properly with exercise, that you don't present. And I want to be very clear and specific. Our body is very resilient and adaptive. You are never really, unless you're a professional athlete, you're not burning calories in the gym in a way that really meaningfully balances out your diet. It is a whole other host and cascade that happens from the exercise that shifts your experience of appetite and shifts your metabolism. So I want to be very plain. The exercise is not to burn calories. The exercise is to change your physiology, and we see that in the change of appetite, etc. So I think it's important. Food's really important. You know, all the people say abs are made in the kitchen, not in the gym. So that's important. But I also want you to remember that we can get creative, and it's always a snip by snip. It's always a gene by gene thing. And this is where the power of, 8,000 visits, visiting with a Dr. Varden to understand what are your Achilles heels and how can we go about addressing them. Dr. Varden, do you want to give a few other examples of ways that you know how to hack some suboptimal SNPs?
Oh, absolutely. And, Christy's question really gets to the heart of epigenetics, how your genes load the gun, but environment, lifestyle, nutrition pull or don't pull the trigger. So because you're absolutely right. It is gene specific, pathway specific, how you want a particular gene or pathway to express. So, if someone, well, let's go with one of the most famous ones, methylation, MTHFR, working on the methylation pathway, because we do look at several genes in that detoxification pathway. So say your methylation pathway and several of your genes, let's say it's the MTHFR gene, okay, that is suboptimal. And, you've got some other genes that are not so great in that pathway. Well, MTHFR, methylation pathway, is tightly correlated with the B vitamins. So if you genetically are dysregulated in that pathway, well, make sure that you are eating B-rich foods. Eat folate-rich foods, dark leafy greens, lentils, asparagus. Make sure that you are having things with those B vitamins. I mean, even meats, organ meats and things like that are rich in the B vitamins. But then you can also take it a step further and personalize it by looking at a couple other genes in your methylation pathway. If you are supplementing to make sure you are getting the correct forms for your genetics for folate B9 and cobalamin B12. So can you handle a methylated form of those particular vitamins, or do you need an adenylated form? That is the power of personalized medicine using your genetics, and we offer that information.
Dr. Varden. All
My
right.
pleasure.
Lynn has a question, and I will take it because I have some case experience or patient experience with this one. So Lynn is saying that they've had their DNA 360. Their 9p21 is 5G, so in that more problematic, concerning space. And if you read the report, what the report will say is because you have a greater risk towards that cardiovascular inflammation, cardiovascular exercise is probably not your friend, and you want to focus more on weight-resistant training. So Lynn is saying that they're a daily runner, they're a former marathon runner, and so they're wondering, do they have to give up essentially this running, which I would imagine, Lynn, based on your history, is something you enjoy. Don't fully get that, but more power to you. I don't understand runners, but I adore you for it. I love that you found it for you. So Lynn, I'll offer this example. So I'm very, very fortunate in my practice that sometimes I get to see professional athletes. And so once upon a time, I saw a professional athlete and we were going over their genes, and they were a similar instance to this. I'm not going to disclose, but effectively, they had a 6G presentation, and they were someone that cardiovascular endurance, like marathon running, was central to the sport that they were doing. And they were an elite performer. And so their comment was like, shoot, my genes, like, am I killing myself by taking on this profession? I'm not open to giving it up. And so the conversation that happened with this person was not necessarily give up what you love, give up this thing that has created a really neat life for you. Instead, the conversation became, cool, if we know that doing this cardiovascular expenditure in your sport is going to be raking a little bit of havoc on your arteries and veins, let's focus on the rest, recovery, and repair instead. Let's focus on protecting it so that when you go in, we're mitigating some of the damage there. So what we started to do is actually create a better recovery plan that was very gene specific, focused on what they were good at, really supported the areas they weren't good at so that they could continue. I'm a big, big, big believer that genes do not dictate destiny. They don't tell you what you cannot do. They do tell you, though, how creative and how disciplined you have to be if you want to circumvent them. Okay, so Lynn, what I would offer there is that if you want some additional personalized support, reach out to us and we can kind of support with that plan, because absolutely you can continue to do what you love. It just, you might want to be very considerate as to how do you support that? How do you mitigate the fallout from that? Because that's what we did with this person, and this person, from what I see on TV, is still kicking along fine, doing their cardiovascular sport. Yeah, go sports. All right,
Wonderful.
Dr. Varden, next question for you, and I think this
All
might be
right.
amongst our last questions of the evening. Leah, I'm not sure, I hope I'm saying that right, Lee or Leah. They're asking, can coconut oil elevate LDL in dangerous ways? Because coconut oil is so popular amongst so many. In other words, in particular, if you have higher LDL levels, do you need to be concerned about having coconut oil in the diet? What is the difference between kind of coconut and animal fats? And then do they need to be careful in particular if they have an ApoE4 variant?
Well, I'll tell you, that's an excellent and nuanced question, especially bringing up the fact of the ApoE4 genotype, because that can influence lipid metabolism and does deserve some extra care. So let's break this down a little bit. So she's asking about coconut oil and LDL cholesterol. So coconut oil. Now, coconut oil is like, I think it's like 82 to about 90% saturated fat, but it's mostly medium chain triglycerides like lauric acid, which is a carbon 12 chain. I know that studies have shown that coconut oil can raise LDL cholesterol compared with unsaturated fats like olive oil, nuts, avocado, but it usually also raises HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol that people say, even though I really don't like the use of bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. But the effect is generally less what we call arthrogenic than butter, meaning that it's affecting the arteries. Okay, so it has less of an effect as compared to saturated fats like butter, cheese, the saturated fat in red meat, because medium chain triglycerides are metabolized faster in the liver and less likely to be stored. So that being said, the rise or coconut oil making LDL levels rise is real, especially for people with ApoE4 carriers, who are more sensitive to saturated fats. But those who are not, you might not see that that more acute effect. Okay. And then I believe she was also asking about animal fats versus coconut oil. Now, I mentioned a little bit about that. So when we consider animal fats, again, butter, cheese, like the meat and the fat in red meat, these are high in what we call palmitic acid and stearic acid, which can definitely impact the rise of LDL particle numbers. And this is reflective in like ApoB, okay, for that test, which is a blood marker test. Coconut oil, like I mentioned, can raise the LDL mostly by increasing the large, the buoyant, big particles, because there's also, when you have LDL, if you do a more stratified testing, it's not just LDL numbers, it's particle size, patterns, it can break it down a little bit more precisely. That gives even more information in regards to cardiovascular risk. So, but again, there's that nuance with the ApoE4. ApoE4 carriers don't clear LDL as efficiently. So any rise in LDL particles, even large ones, may increase cardiovascular risk. May, okay, because there's other factors going on. So to really round out, her question and the nuance of her question, coconut fat and animal fat, they don't affect LDL identically, okay? But both can elevate the levels in a way that could matter if you are an ApoE4 carrier. So I hope that, made a little more sense and kind of teased out the nuances in that. So, because that is a concern. I have a lot of people, a lot of clients who come in who, have ApoE4 and are worried about that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan.
You're welcome.
Audience, I hope this was helpful. I hope this really illuminated to you the importance of genes. Give a lot of information. They tell us everything about nature, but we have to be very mindful of the nurture. We have to be mindful of the signals that we're inputting, and we have to be mindful as well that when we combine a whole host of genes together, that shifts how we need to be engaging and offering that clinical plan. If there's anyone in the audience that is looking for this sort of support, do not hesitate to reach out to us. This is clearly our passion. This is clearly what we love doing, and we'd be happy to help you. Just use the email ceo@thednacompany.com, and we'll connect you with a good provider. The CEO will quite literally do it herself. And then if you do not have and are interested in getting the DNA 360 panel, feel free to use the promo code MENO, MENO 10, and that will give you a 10% discount for the next 24 hours. So that's not a forevermore code, that's just for the next 24 hours. Audience, thank you so very much for being here with us this evening. Dr. Varden, thank you for coming and sharing your clinical experience and your clinical pearls. I appreciate it, and I'm going to speculate and offer on behalf of the audience. I probably guess that they do as well. So thank you so very much, Medell.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see you next week. Watch your emails. You'll see all the topics and things that we are going to be covering. We're very grateful to have you here this evening. Dr. Varden, shall we dance out?
Absolutely. Get that exercise and movement in.
Yes, ma'am. Audience, we encourage you to dance out with us, because dancing, when we look at exercise, is the best way to improve your mental health. All right. Au revoir, mes amis. Au revoir. Oh, I'm in a chair. It's going to be interesting. Here we go.